Chapter 33. The sky was turning pale in the east, and before he slid the alien mask into place, Rash could see the top of the Chrysler building, a few blocks uptown, beginning to glitter in the light of dawn. Half of Carr's men had dozed off, sprawled here and there along the garage entrance walls, surrounded by their weapons. Schaefer knelt on the sidewalk, the Soviet anti-tank gun ready beside him, while Rash took a turn watching the skies above 3rd Avenue. "Come on, Schaefer," Carr growled. "Take your goddamn shot, for Christ's sake. You let a half dozen of the bastards go by. If this was baseball, you'd have struck out watching them hours ago." "If this was baseball, I'd have walked, not struck out," Schaefer replied calmly. "I want something I can hit. If I miss, a rocket-propelled grenade is going to make a pretty big hole in somebody's storefront." "Who gives a shit?" "I do." "The insurance will cover it. Take a shot, for Christ's sake." "Here it comes again," Rash called. Lower and slower this time. He handed the mask to Schaefer. Schaefer took the mask, held it up and grinned. He raised the anti-tank gun. "Got it this time, Carr," Schaefer exulted as he hefted the weapon and sighted. Rash held the mask for him so that Schaefer would have both hands free to work the gun. "He's cruising right up the middle of the avenue. Just where I want him," Schaefer reported. "I can put this baby just where I want it. Right." He pulled the trigger, and the rocket spat out of the tube. "There." A fraction of a second later, the boom of the RPG echoed from the buildings on either side, and shrapnel rained down across 3rd Avenue, rattling off asphalt and taxicabs. The sound woke the dozing hoods. Hands grabbed for weapons, heads whirled. For a moment after the flash, everyone in the garage entryway glimpsed the outline of the ship, flickering above the streets in a shower of blue sparks and burning rocket fragments. Then it vanished again, to everybody but Schaefer. "Didn't do much more than scratch the paint," he said. "But I didn't expect any better. At least that should get their attention." He took off the mask and waved to the others. "Come on, let's move out. Get ready for them. They'll be coming to see who took a shot at them." "Move your asses!" Carr shouted, and the motley collection of New York's worst stirred, rose and moved. The little squad of New York's defenders trotted out into the street and found a thin scatter of people on both sidewalks, early risers and diehards from the night before who had been going about their business and had been drawn out by the explosion, curious about what new peculiarity the city had come up with. "Clear the streets!" Schaefer bellowed. "Now!" He gestured to Carr's recruits. "Half of you on one side of the street, the other half come with me. Get the civilians out of here before the aliens arrive." "You heard the man," Carr shouted. He fired a burst in the air, 6 rounds. "Get the fuck out of here!" Rash charged out with the rest, but a bit less enthusiastically. This sort of action might be his partner's cup of tea, but Christ, he was just a cop. He'd never even worked emergency services. He watched Carr's men hounding citizens into doorways and down alleys, and wondered what the hell he was doing here. Armed assaults on bug-eyed invisible saucer men were never part of his job description. He realized suddenly that somehow, out of all the hardware that had been handed out, he'd wound up with nothing but his own familiar pistol. He held it ready in one hand, but somehow he doubted it was going to do much good. He paused in the doorway of a camera shop, between signs reading "1 day only" and "Our biggest sale ever," and scanned the sky, pointlessly. The goddamn spaceships were invisible. He knew that. A security guard emerged from the shop behind him. "Hey, Mac," the rent-a-cop called. "What's going on? Who the hell are you?" "Police," Rash said, fishing his ID from his pocket and flashing the badge. "We're being attacked by monsters from outer space." "Right," the guard said after a pause. "Big green ones, I suppose." Rash turned. "Look, bozo, you asked," he said. "This is for real, okay? You're in a fucking war zone." The guard stared at him. "Just get out of sight, will you?" Rash said. "Believe me or not, but this whole neighborhood's going to be full of flying lead in a few minutes, and you don't want to be here." "Jesus," the guard said. "You're serious? And on the big sale day?" He turned and ran back inside, locking the door behind him. The glass door. Lot of protection that was going to be when the shooting started, Rash thought. Still, It was probably better than being out here in the open, the way he was. This wasn't anything he'd ever wanted. Schaefer had his own reasons for being on the force. Maybe he'd always been looking for some kind of big apocalyptic shootout. But Rash had just wanted a steady job where he felt he could do some good. He looked at one of Carr's gang waving some kind of machine gun around and felt a chill that wasn't just the breeze from the west. It was fear. He had a wife and children. He wanted to make pension, find a place upstate somewhere, settle down and watch his kids grow up, hear them laugh. He didn't want to die, and it looked very much as if he was about to. He'd taken out one of these space predators down at Carr's place, but that one had been alone, and he'd caught it by surprise, not to mention he'd been armed a bit more heavily. Somehow he doubted he was going to be anywhere near as lucky against whatever came out of that ship Schaefer had just taken a shot at. Hell, if they wanted to, the aliens could probably take out all of Midtown without even warming up their heavy stuff. If this turned into a real fight, it would be because the aliens wanted to fight. Rash was beginning to think seriously about why he was still there, why he hadn't turned and run for his life, when he heard sirens. "Oh shit," he said. Someone must have called in about the explosion and the lunatics running around with guns. Maybe a prowl car had seen something. Whatever the reason, the cops were coming. And somehow, Rash didn't think they were coming to join the war against the monsters. The familiar blue cars were charging up 3rd Avenue in an unbroken phalanx, lights flashing and sirens at full blast. And Rash was in deep shit with the department. He knew that. McComb was in with the feds on this, siding with the monsters in hopes they'd go home happy. And even if no one cared about that, Rash had walked off with about half a ton of illegal weapons from the police lab, and he'd passed them out to a bunch of the worst hoods in the city. McComb was going to love that. Rash faded back into the shelter of the doorway. All along the block, Carr and his men were doing the same. Only Schaefer was still standing out there in plain sight on the east sidewalk, watching as the cop cars pulled up. And sure enough, just as Rash had expected, it was Captain McComb, wearing a flak jacket and carrying a bullhorn, who climbed out of the lead unit. "This is Captain McComb of the New York Police Department," he announced. "We have the area sealed off. You're surrounded. You have 10 seconds to throw down your weapons and give yourselves up, and then we're coming in after you." Schaefer stepped off the curb, M16 in one hand, the alien mask in the other. "You don't know what you're doing, McComb," he called. "Those things have to be stopped." "What in the hell?" McComb asked. He snatched a shotgun from the car and pointed it at Schaefer. "Schaefer, you're running this. Someone has to." "You've lost it this time, Schaefer," McComb shouted. "I'll probably make assistant chief for taking you out, and I'm going to enjoy it." He raised the shotgun. "Last chance, Schaefer. Drop the..." Then, as Rash watched from the camera shop doorway, several things happened simultaneously. Schaefer suddenly jerked his head sideways and clutched at his neck, at the device that was embedded there. McComb stopped in mid-sentence and stared, open-mouthed, up the avenue. A shadow appeared from nowhere, instantly covering the full width of the avenue, blocking out the pink light of dawn. Schaefer twisted to look behind himself, up at the immense spaceship that rested heavily on the pavement of 3rd Avenue, its central landing rib gouging into the asphalt, its curving surfaces shading the street and almost touching the buildings on either side. An oily black stain on the white hull, black near the tail, marked where Schaefer's RPG had hit. "Well, what do you know?" Schaefer said. "Company."